Hello, everybody. You are very welcome to today's Radio Centre Ireland webinar. And today's webinar follows on from many webinars we've already done this year. So earlier in the year, we focused on music and the role and the power music has in terms of audio advertising. We looked at the connections between listeners and the audio platform and how they really connect together. And we also looked at audio attribution, how both digital audio and broadcast radio drive business outcomes for advertisers. So really interesting subject matters. They are all on the Radio Centre Ireland website. You can read a summary of those webinars. You can watch those webinars in full and you can download the presentation decks as you can do for all the webinars from previous years. So there's loads of insights on the Radio Centre Ireland website. And that will be added to today for today's webinar, which will also be on the website by tomorrow. And today we're looking at a really interesting area, the JNLR. The JNLR uncovered data you did not know you had. So as you, I'm sure, are all aware, you're probably already familiar with the JNLR. The latest data was released last week, and you'll probably be very familiar with the type of data that was showcased last week. But you probably didn't know there's lots of data that is simply overlooked or often underused. And in order to take us through that type of data, I'm delighted to welcome to the webinar Nessa Carter, who started this year as the Jane Allure Executive Lead. Nessa has over 20 years experience in research. She was previously the Insights and Data Manager at RTE. She also worked with the TAM measurement system, and she worked with EBU as well in terms of new media measurement. And she has a huge wealth of experience in this area. And today she is going to take you through some data that you may not know you have access to within the JNR systems. Just before I hand over to Nessa, just to say there is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. If you type in a question for Nessa, I will ask that question on your behalf. But now I'd hand over to Nessa, and very welcome, Nessa. Over to you.
Thanks, Kieran. Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. Delighted to be invited to present today at the May webinar. So, as Kieran has already said, there's tons of data in the JNLR that everybody uses really, really well all of the time. However, there is a lot of information in there that maybe we don't use as much as we might, and or maybe we don't know where to find it. So, I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so taking you through some of the key behavioral and insight data that I think will be very useful for everybody on the call. The focus is going to be on digital device usage and behaviors through the radio day. So, as everybody knows, the JNLR survey measures radio listening through the day by 15-minute intervals. What it also does for each 15 minutes, it not only measures what station you listen to, but it also measures what device you use to listen to that station. So, FM radio, mobile phone, smart speaker, PC, laptop, and a connected TV. So there's plenty of information in there that I'm going to share with you today. And as Kieran said, pop any messages in the chat and I'm happy to answer them at the end. So for this presentation, I'm focusing on any radio only, so very top level, and the available audience, so plenty of opportunities there for everybody, and weekday listening only. Okay, so we talk about reach and share all the time, how many listeners my station got, how many listeners my program got, what age they are, who they are, and what my share is in terms of the overall market. So reach is volume and share is the depth of listening and loyalty. So we're all very, very familiar with those terms. So for example, we'll always see the 3.5 million adults who listen to the radio every single day, which is fantastic numbers. We all know them, 78% here. I'm charting reach in white and the reach percentage in the orange bar on the top. So, you know, we look at adult 15 plus, huge reach, 78%. Then we look at the shoppers with kids. There are just over 1 million of them listening every day with 80% reach. Then we have 15 to 24s, 60% of these listening every day, and so on up to 65 plus, where we have very high reach at 87%. Then on the right-hand side, just to demonstrate, I've just added some charts. So we have share charts, which we're used to seeing for adults 15 plus, share of any national and share of any regional local listening. So 46% share for national versus 54% share for any regional, and so on. As we look at 15 to 34s, we know that the split shifts to any regional local. And then for over 35, plus. For 35 plus, it's split really between any national and local in terms of share. So we're really familiar with these metrics. What we don't talk about as often is how did all of these people actually listen to the radio? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that now in the coming slides. So we have a report called the JNLR Platforms Report, and in that report, it's released every quarter. We can look at the people who listened to radio by any digital device. So any digital device, I mean mobile, smart speaker, PC, laptop, and connected TV. And then we can break it down by audience as well. So we have demographics on all of these devices. This chart just shows the roll up of all of this digital listening. And what we have is over 500,000 listening to the radio on a digital device every day. That's 12% of the adult population. As we move through the age breaks, what stands out for me straight away is that reach of 12% rises to 15% among 15 to 24s. So that's a very, very significant number. 15 to 24s, 15% of them listening on a device, most likely mobile or smart speaker, every single day, over 100,000. And as we'd expect, not bad for the 25 to 44s, up to 45 to 64s, slips down to 8% for over 65s, which is something that we'd expect to see. What we can also look at, and this is important for future behaviours and future-proofing radio, is the number of those who only listen to the radio using a digital device, which means exactly what it says, that they're not using FM radio to listen to radio. So again, I'm charting the same demographics, but now this is looking at those who are only using a digital device. So we have 6% of adults who listen to the radio, but they're only listening on a mobile and so on. This goes up to 1 in 10, 15 to 24. So this is significant. And this will be a theme through the presentation, is the importance of digital device and digital listening for the younger, harder to reach cohort. So we have 72,000 15 to 24s listening to the radio every day, but they're only listening on a digital device. And again, as you move through the age breaks, this reach gets lower and lower. We're about 4% for 65 plus. So again, we're used to seeing share donut charts, and many of us will already be familiar with the share of listening by digital device. So as I've said, share of listening indicates share of minutes, it's loyalty, it's depth of listening. And straight away, we can see the light blue chart is FM radio, and the bulk of minutes does still come through an FM radio, 88% share. We've smart speaker here at 8% share, so that's the next biggest chunk. Then we have mobile at almost 3%, and laptop and TV are relatively small. However, moving on to 15 to 34 age break, we can see that digital listening goes from 12% here up to 17% of minutes among 15 to 34s. FM radio still extremely strong and the biggest device. And we also have significant listening through smart speaker, but we can see mobile is now at almost 7% share. PC laptop is higher than average, and TV is very low. And again, to complete the audience view, if you look at over 35s, we can see that FM, it goes up to 90% share. That's what we expect. But still, 1 in 10 minutes listened to on a digital device. And smart speaker again at 8%. So smart speaker as a digital device kind of delivers across the board. It's strong for all audiences. Where we really see the differences is when we look at mobile for younger audiences. So we can actually look at devices in more detail. So what I've done is, and this is very broad, I haven't gone into too much detail, but what I've done is look at reach by device by age break. So we talk about 78% reach of adults listening to the radio. This is a similar concept. So we have mobile here on the top left, and we've got adults 15 plus, 15 to 24, and moving through the chart, we look at reach for mobile at 4% for all adults. However, this doubles for 15 to 24s. So it's almost 9% reach. So 1 in 10 for 15 to 24s listening to the radio via a mobile every single day. It's crucial for the younger cohort. And then we look down below that in the green to smart speaker. And as I've already said, smart speaker at 7% reach. It actually delivers across the board. Highest reach actually among 45 to 64s. And as we'll see later on, smart speaker tied to a location, it's tied to a room or an office or workplace. It tends to behave a little bit more like FM radio. Whereas if you look at something like mobile, that has quite a different behavior, as in it's people on the move, it's always in your pocket. So these are two very different devices, delivering digitally and important in their own way. Reach for PC and laptop and reach for TV set are quite low. But again, we see over index for 15 to 24s at about 1.3% of those listening to the radio on this device every day. We can also convert this reach into numbers. And again, just highlighting smart speaker here, over 300,000 listening to radio via smart speaker every single day. Over 170,000 listening to radio on a mobile every day. And that's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday through the week. Again, low numbers for PC and very, very low numbers for TV. Not forgetting FM radio, the traditional FM radio, which continues to dominate listening. Reach here is 71%. So still very, very strong. But what I'm highlighting here is how reach grows as the audience grows. So we 50% of 15 to 24s listening to radio on a traditional radio, and that rises up to 83% for over 65s. Numbers are still extremely strong. Over 3 million listening on a traditional radio every single day, and 300,000 15 to 24s. Below this, I've just rolled up all of the digital devices on the previous page. We have an any digital figure, just to give you the relative numbers between the two. So 12% reach for any digital device versus 71% for radio. There is going to be a lot of growth here, though, so it's one to watch. Obviously, it's very, very important, and the numbers are not insignificant. So we can also profile each device in terms of audience. So we can build a listener profile by device, which is effectively splitting the reach into percentages for each of these. Now, again, we can look at this any digital figure by device. For the purpose of this, I'll just roll them all up into any digital, but we could look at this individually for mobile, smart speaker, PC, laptop, and so on. So what I'm doing is looking at age profile for FM radio versus digital, looking at social grouping profile, and I'm also looking at gender profile. And you can see differences stand out straight away. For example, those listening on a digital device tend to be a little more ABC1 versus radio, which is a bit more balanced. We look at FM radio, as I've already said, 22% over 65, so it skews a little bit older, whereas any digital skews younger with 20% of reach coming from 15 to 24s here. And then if we look at gender profile, we can see any digital tends to be a little more female versus FM radio, which is a bit more balanced. So I suppose what's really interesting for me is how these devices fit into the radio day. And as I've already said, we can look at listening by 50 minutes throughout a weekday and a weekend, Saturday and Sunday. For this, I'm focusing on weekdays. But where do devices come in through the day? So what I've done is I've taken any radio listening. So this is the available audience on an average weekday, adults 15 plus, and charted their listening from 6 in the morning right through to midnight. The blue is FM radio listening. So the reach in each quarter delivered by FM. And the white is the reach in each quarter delivered by a digital device. So that's total digital listening. So you can see straight away, bulk of listening is coming from an FM radio. However, there is a sizable amount coming through in digital, and it's fairly consistent in terms of size. Where it really comes into its own is in the evening. Now, we're all familiar with the traditional slump around 5 or 6 p.m. when radio starts to dip off and people switch into other media usage. So say for on average, digital is delivering about 12% of reach in each of these quarters. When we get up past 7 o'clock, that delivery turns to 18 to 20% of total reach. So digital becomes very important here in holding up the audience, and it delivers more of our thousands in the evening time, which is kind of a shift in behavior. And it's a great opportunity as well for us to reach these people who may previously have just switched off the radio. So what I always like to do is, and it's a similar slide to the previous, but look at the pattern of listening. So does the digital pattern mimic the FM pattern through the day, or are there periods where it slumps when FM doesn't, and vice versa? So it's the same chart, 6 a.m. to midnight. What I've done is plot FM radio in blue and digital on white on two different axes. So yes, FM thousands are significantly greater than digital for now. However, I like to map them so I can see where we may have digital performing better relatively to FM. And for me, what I saw straight away is that digital reach, which I've already mentioned, this shows an uplift at 7 p.m., whereas the blue line FM kind of continues to decline right through. We have digital holding up in the evenings. That stood out for me. Again, what I wanted to do then was break out this white line. So this is all of our digital devices in total. What do they look like by device itself? So again, looking at the average weekday from 6 to midnight, but now what we're looking at is the different devices and how they're behaving through the day for adults 15 plus. And I'm going to break this down by audience later on. The green line is smart speaker. And actually, what stands out for me here is behavior is quite similar in terms of the peak in listening. It peaks at 9 o'clock, just like radio does. It's very, very strong in terms of digital listening. We look at the mobile device here, that's in blue. It's quite a bit lower and it doesn't actually overtake smart speaker at any point of the day, even in the evening. Then we've got PC laptop here in the grey line and TV at the bottom in red, and those numbers are actually are very, very small. What this does say to me, though, if I'm looking at the peaks in mobile, it peaks here at 8 a.m. and it peaks here again 5 p.m. So to me, this is saying mobile listeners are on the move. And these peaks and troughs are actually quite driven by under 35s, as I'll show later. But again, what it says to me when we're thinking about behaviors, people listening on their phone, potentially on the move, they're commuting, they're traveling to school, they're dropping kids to school, they're out and about. So they're peaking around here. They're getting on, potentially they're now listening to the radio up here, but then they're coming back in when they're on the move again at 5 o'clock, slumps, and then it comes back up again in the evening time. So as I've said, I'm going to look at all of this by different age breaks because this is where we see some real differences emerge. Um, so these under 35s, this audience that really digital is so important for, what are their behaviors like through the day? So just to summarize very quickly their overall statistics. So we have 65% of them listening to the radio every day, regardless of device. That's the total number. That's almost 900,000 listening every single day. I've split out platforms, so the devices, the reach for each of these. So we have 56% of them tuning into a FM radio, 14% on listening on any digital device, 7% on smart speaker, 7% on mobile, um, and 1% on PC laptop. And there's some big numbers here, particularly for any digital. It's almost 200,000 of them every day. 121,000 of them only use a digital device to listen to the radio. So that's about 9 or 10% of these guys. So that's quite a lot. And again, when we're thinking about future behaviors, it's an important one to consider as these guys age up into the older brackets. They're going to bring these habits with them. And 70% of the minutes listened to the radio are listened to a digital device. So how did their listening look? So again, I'm charting the same slide I did for adults, only I'm doing it for 15 to 34s across the average weekday. And you can see the orange is the FM. And yes, digital does deliver FM listening does still deliver the bulk. However, the proportion of digital delivered is greater than it is than the average. We have an average about 19% of reach in each quarter delivered by digital versus 12% for the average adult. And then when we get into the evening, you can see here as FM is declining, actually digital is actually holding up quite well, and it's delivering over a third of thousands in each quarter from 7 p.m. to 10 p.m., which is a lot of listening, and it's important here. It's at the right time. And I've already mentioned the share. And actually, again, looking at the pattern of FM listening on one axis here in the orange versus digital listening in the white, and the axis is here. The hold up that I mentioned for adults 15 plus after the kind of decline at FM at 5 is much more significant for this group. To me, there's a real opportunity here to try and grab some of these people. And as we know from the total audio report that the Jane Law releases every year, if they're listening here to radio, you can be sure they're listening to something else digitally as well. So if we know they're here, we know they're listening, there's a real opportunity for radio to try and grab some of these and convert them from whatever audio they're listening to radio as well. Again, looking at the mobile pattern, and this is the white line that I've just showed you split out by device. So digital thousands here. Now, again, it's quite low, but this is the future and this will grow. Smart speaker here, it's a little more volatile as you can see these lines. We have smart speaker and mobile almost on a par in terms of numbers for 15 to 34s. which we don't see with the over 35s or the average adult. So mobile here, very important in the morning. Again, they're on the move. It does fall off for this age break, while smart speaker stays up. So they are still listening. They're just listening on a different device. But then we see from here how the trend really differs to the FM trend, and that we're seeing that mobile numbers switching up and up and up. And really they grow until 5 o'clock, they dip off again, and then they come back in here at 5 o'clock or 7 o'clock, which is really, really important. So it's kind of an opposite. It's a different trend, the FM trend. Um, as I've already mentioned, how close the numbers are between smart speaker and mobile in the mornings. And then in the evenings, mobile takes over from smart speaker here from around 6:30, 6 o'clock. And it's ahead of smart speaker reach for the rest of the evening, which is not something we see with overall adults and certainly not for 35 plus. Speaking of 35 plus, I've done the same thing for this group just so we can contrast them with the under 35s. So obviously they're a bigger cohort, they're two-thirds of the population. So it's 35 plus. We have 83% of them tuning into the radio every day. That's over 2.5 million of them every single day. Looking at the devices that they're listening on, 78% are on an FM radio, 11% on a digital device. And if you remember, 15 to 34s were 14%. So smart speaker is the same, 7%. Mobile is lower, 3% versus 7% for 15 to 34s. Similar per PC laptop, around 1% reach. 164,000 only use a digital device to listen to the radio. This is about 5%. And if you remember, 15 to 34s was more like 10%. And then 1 in 10 minutes listened to the radio among this cohort are listened via a digital device. Again, it's not insignificant. Looking at the same trend through the day here, and this is the last set of these charts you're going to sit through. I know it's a lot, but the red is FM radio, and you can see straight away, as we've seen with others, that FM delivers the bulk of reach. Digital doesn't deliver as much as it does for the under 35s, about 12% on average, versus 19% for under 35s. And while it does deliver over average really late at night, it's not giving the same numbers or same relative proportion as it does for the under 35s. So while it does deliver digital listening, it's not as important for this cohort. And then if we split out the devices, so the white line here, and we split that into the devices, you can see straight away the importance of smart speaker. It's ahead of every other device by quite a lot throughout the day for this age group, again, following the FM pattern and never really being challenged by the other digital devices at any point. I did want to have a quick look at reach via mobile phone among under 35s versus over 35s. And they're a very different pattern. And again, yes, the numbers are small, so they'll bounce around, but this pattern I've looked at over a few books and it's the same. We have 15 to 34s in the orange line, very, very strong in the mornings. They drop off, while 35 plus, they stay fairly stable. But then from the evening time, we see under 35 mobile listening. And considering the different population sizes of both, we have mobile overtaking smart speaker for among 15 to 34, greater listening than 35 plus here from the evening time and staying ahead of over 35s right up until midnight. So again, I'm banging this drum here of how important mobile is. So what about programs? So I've spoken about any radio and I've spoken about behaviors, but we do talk about program reach, and it's useful to know that we can actually look at individual time blocks or programs by device as well. So I'm going to finish up with a couple of slides on that. So we talk about how many listen to a show or a time block. So for the purposes of this, I have produced any radio constructed time block. So I'm not looking at a specific station, but they are time blocks through the day and it's available audience. So 7 to 9, 9 to 11, 11 to 2, 2 to 5, 5 to 7, and 7 to 4. And you can reproduce this for your own time blocks, bearing in mind sample size and so on. But for radio group, that's fine. For larger stations, it's fine. Just to bear in mind sample. So we talk about reach and we get these big numbers listening to the programs through the day. But what we don't talk about as much is how they listened to my program, and we can actually get that information out of there. So here we can see how mobile now is adding another 43,000, 36,000, 50,000 here at 11 o'clock, 60,000 and so on to my program. The white is FM radio, by the way. Should have said that. Then we see smart speaker coming in. I mean, you can see the value of a smart speaker straight away. There are decent numbers there for this. Again, it kind of behaves, as I've said, like a FM radio in ways, but we see that digital listening is contributing about 10% of reach to each of these time blocks, and that digital contribution grows as the night goes on, with mobile staying fairly consistent there. And again, we can look at this for under 35s. And again, what's important here is the bigger contribution of digital listening to my program. Particularly here between 2 and 5, almost 70% of my reach is delivered by a digital device. And then later on, between 5 and 7, it's 21%. And later into the nighttime, it's almost 30%. So again, it's very interesting information, really, really useful. And again, it just highlights the importance of digital. So just in summary, I hope I've shown radio can be consumed everywhere and anywhere, and the JNLR has lots of data which highlights this. So using the JNLR, we can talk about how as well as how many, and different devices serve different needs depending on the time of day. For example, smart speaker behavior is quite similar to FM radio, while mobile really connects radio to the listener rather than the location. It's always in your pocket, it's always there. It's a great opportunity, and it's also a challenge. And then, as I've said multiple times, digital is crucial for younger listeners, especially mobile. So I'll hand back to Kieran now.
That is fantastic, Nessa. I think there's huge insight in that presentation, really superbly well delivered. And I think there's so much fascinating insight that I'm sure people have not looked at the data in that way actually before. So I think I'm really delighted with that presentation, Nessa. You gave so much different kind of views of how you can look at the data. Just a couple of questions from me, and then there's some questions on the chat. And the first
Mhm.
question from me is, you talked about that we usually talk about how many, but not how and how they listen. So how do you think the general users could make use of this device level data going forward?
Yeah, so I mean, I think as I've shown in the behavior charts, that for some audiences, particularly under 35s, different devices come into their own at different times of the day. So, if we consider who is using what at what time, for example, over under 35s in the evenings, and then we look at the total audio report that the Jane Law releases every year, we know that people are listening to audio other than radio. So if they're listening to radio at these times, they are going to be listening to other types of audio. So there's an opportunity to reach some of these and try and grab them. Again, we know that mobile users, they look like they're on the move a bit more. So they're peaking at 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. So how do we communicate with listeners at these times? Just considering what we're promoting, how to promote it, how we communicate. Um, Also, I would think about the discovery aspect as well, in terms of being sure that people know how to find our content when they're looking for it at different times of the day.
Yeah, that all makes very interesting, interesting commentary. And I think it's something people need to take on board. Just getting into a little bit more specifics. Smart speaker seems to mirror FM listening habits through the day,
Mm.
but mobile behaves quite differently. And does this suggest there's kind of two different patterns involving in terms of two distinct listening patterns of behavior, FM and smart speaker being one, and other digital listening being another?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, we've got smart speaker, which is behaving quite like FM.
Mm,
It's tied to a location, so it'll be in your kitchen, your sitting room, your bedroom, office, and so on. Mobile, you're taking it with you. Smart speaker potentially will have more shared listening events because you potentially have more people in the room. The mobile um, context, potentially, you're not tied. For example, if I want to listen to the radio 7 o'clock, but people are in the sitting room watching TV or in the kitchen listening to something I don't want to listen to, I can go
yeah.
up to my own room, switch on my mobile and listen to what I want to listen to. So that is changing behaviors. And I think you're seeing it when you see the uplift in listening digital, a bit outside the traditional decline in radio around 5 or 6. You know, shared media consumption has changed and it will continue to change, particularly as these younger audiences grow into older audiences and bring these different behaviors with them. So, not listening to the radio together, potentially, being more considered in what I choose to listen to.
Okay. Yeah, that makes perfect sense, actually. And I'm reading a question coming from some of the attendees, and I kind of touched on it earlier. And it's actually a question I was going to suggest as well, is what show or factor do we attribute to the change in behavior from FM post 7 p.m. on digital? Now, you kind of touched on that in your last answer, but
Yeah, I, I,
maybe
I definitely think
expand on that.
I think for me, when I look at this, I think, well, you know, media consumption has changed. And, I've seen in previous research, in previous roles, before the shared sitting together to listen to something or watch something, that has shifted. People are in different rooms of the house now, consuming differently. They're less likely to be together at weekends or in the evenings. They're listening to what they want to listen to. So, to my mind, when I see that, it's being impacted by a lot of media are being impacted by this change in behavior, um, possibly more solo listening and a bit less shared listening.
Mm, okay. Next question, which would be close to your heart, and I know we are looking at this as a JNR committee right at the moment, but the question that comes in is, can in-car listening from a connected dashboard be seen as a separate device, or how does that work? Now, I know this is an area we are looking at, Nessa, but
Yeah,
maybe you'll expand on that.
it's very important to us. In-car listening and connected car is going to be a challenge. There's no doubt about it for the radio industry. Opportunity and a challenge. But at the moment, the way the Jane Law measures in the survey, it will ask about radio listening in a car or at home on an FM radio. If it's a connected TV specific device, it won't split that out. Now, if you're connected via your mobile and you're listening in your car and you say, I was listening on my mobile in the survey, then that will pick it up, but it'll go into mobile. We don't have connected car TV, but it is something that we're looking at because it is an area that is going to impact, and it's something we need to understand a lot more. How people are listening in the car and what they're using to listen in the car. It's a great question.
And yeah, but we are actively looking at that at the
We're
moment, anyway.
actively looking at that as a committee at the moment and how we
Yeah.
can look at measuring it. So we're actually speaking to Ipsos BNA about maybe looking at options for us to trial later in the year. And yeah, we'll report back on that as soon as we have something.
Everything you presented today was from an any total radio perspective, but obviously all that data is available by station. Just maybe expand on that briefly.
It is. So obviously I'm just speaking about any radio. And it's a huge sample. If you think about the Jane Laura sample is over 16,700 interviews across the year. 5,000 of almost 5,000 of which are 15 to 34s. Um, it's really, really, really robust. So we can look at this data certainly at any radio level. When we get into quarter hours, we can look at it at any radio level. You can also look at it by station. I would caveat just being aware of sample sizes. The larger stations will be okay. Some of the certainly the sales house group can all look at their data in that way. If you have any doubt, you can contact me. But yeah, it's all that time block, everything I showed you can get at a station level. And the Jane Law platform support has it there in a spreadsheet for you.
Now, as soon as the presentation is over, people are going to run off to try and access some of the data you have just
Yeah.
showcased. How do they do that? How do they access this type of data?
So as I've just said, the Jane Law platforms report is released every quarter. It's on the Ipsos BNA website, if you're a subscriber. So you can just go in and go to, I think it's platforms or supplementary reports. And that will have all of the device top level data that I showed. So reach by device, share by device, and the breakdown of reach and so on by station and any radio. That's all in that report. If you want to get into the behavioral data that I showed, so the quarter hour data, listening through the day, that's AdServe. So if you have an AdServe account, you can go in there and look at it by quarter hour. And you can look at your time blocks that way as well. Again, just a caveat, be cautious about sample. The lower the sample, the more volatility. But that any questions there, just shoot me a note.
Just to, I suppose, emphasize that within AdServe, you can look at by device, depending on
Absolutely.
so people, not sure anybody may be aware of that. So
Yeah. Yeah. I ran all of that data for quarter hours and for time blocks in AdServe, looking at where, well, it's called where I listened in AdServe, and myself and Karen were having a laugh about that the other day, saying it should be how, but yes,
yeah.
it's all there.
And then, finally, this is more just not much a question, but more just letting people know, and you're very, actually, you're hugely familiar with this, Nessa, because you're driving this project. And we did announce last October publicly that obviously all the information that Nessa has presented today is based on claimed behavior. So people are asked questions, how they listen as well as what they listen to. But obviously, there's IP data that's available as well with your server logs. And we are working on a project with Ipsos and with GFK to essentially take demographic data from the Jane Law and overlay it on top of IP server log data, which is actual, universal data that's available each day. So it's a complex project, and it'll take a while for it all to come to fruition. And it is a proof of concept. We should add as well. We need to do a concept and ensure that it works. So I'm really just letting everybody on the webinar be aware of that. Maybe Nessa, you might just add a comment or two in relation to that.
Yeah, so we're working with GFK on this project, and we are in the middle of basically getting all of the um broadcasters to start thinking about how to deliver their server logs. It's first party IP data, so it's a ton of data. It's literally coming from the broadcasters' analytic systems. So we're talking about millions and millions and millions of devices. So obviously what the Jane Law talks about is people, which is the beauty of it. And we get all of this lovely demographic data, but the IP data is census data. So that's just device-based data. And as you can imagine, there's tons of rules around how we define what listening is and how they define what listening is, and cleaning data. But ultimately what it's going to do is, and what will be great for us, is we'll get all of this first party data from the broadcasters, and we'll be able to see how that lines up with the JNLR when all of this modeling is done. What it will do is say, okay, maybe FM listening should actually have more minutes than the JNLR is giving it, or maybe digital listening should get more minutes than the JNLR is giving it in the recall based survey. So what it's going to do is kind of almost recalibrate some of the numbers. The overall numbers won't change. You're still going to get your total reach. It's just within that, you may see slight differences in the FM versus the digital reach. That's
Great.
exciting. Yeah,
Indeed,
good
sure
project.
is. And I think that is it. Unless anybody wants to put in any more questions on the Q&A button, and if not, we'll all let you go and have an early lunch potentially. So I think we are done for today. Thank you everybody for attending. Just to let you know, the next webinar will be in June, and it'll be showcasing some of the great work, some of the awarded work creatively and from a media planning perspective. So that webinar will take place towards the end of June. So look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you very much for your time, and see you soon. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye bye.